depends on the needs. So let's take a look at some of these interventions, starting with applied behavioral analysis. Gets its roots in with the work of Eugene Watson, Skinner, focuses on operant condition, shaping behaviors. So in other words, let's really focus on what's causing a behavior, analyzing what it is and what's the consequence on the other side. The idea of antecedent behavior consequence is a real gift that the behavioral practitioners have given us. We have TEACH, which works on a person's strengths and emerging capabilities, workstations, ordering the environment so that the person can be successful. Daily life therapy comes from Japan, focuses on ordering the physical, emotional, intellectual components of the child. We're going to get more into that as well. One major difference that daily life therapy has from the others is that work is done in groups. Somehow the children are taught in groups, sometimes large groups, and it works. They still manage to provide support. And that flies against conventional wisdom that one-to-one is the way to go. Miller method, we'll hear more from him. We're moving into more the cognitive developmental approaches. Floor time, actually they like to call floor time DIR, developmental individual relations difference. This works more on the emotional aspect of things. Stephen Goodstein with his relational development intervention, which is, you can look at that almost as an outgrowth of the Miller method, and the idea of sharing experiences, or experience sharing, rather than instrumental relationships. Experience sharing is the type of relationships that we have, for example, with our friends. The new kid on the block, we're going to hear from Barry Prezant tomorrow or the next day or both. And he focuses on a good assessment of the child's needs and then using whatever is out there to provide for these needs. And all I did was mention the educational behavioral developmental. There's the whole biomedical realm. There's the whole sensory integration and other types of intervention. CCT is very important. CCT is the oldest method. It has an average latency time of probably 15.5 seconds. And the intervention is effective. Now, CCT stands for cranial concussive therapy. A lead pipe or a piece of wood, and you achieve immediate compliance. You eliminate a lot of autistic tendencies. You eliminate a lot of other tendencies too. Just making sure you're awake after lunch. And I didn't see anybody researching into these areas. Sometimes I'd see in a book a couple of paragraphs about one intervention and then another, but they were all just presented in sequence. But nobody has really gone in to deeply look at the characteristics of the different interventions and how they can help people on the autism spectrum. So in other words, the question is not which is the best approach, but what is the best approach for this child at this time? Lauren Underwood talked about that this morning. This is also something that I felt was vitally important to put in this Understanding Autism for Dummies books, to get this information into the hands of parents, teachers, and other people supporting those on the autism spectrum as fast as possible. This is just one small piece of applied behavioral analysis, discrete trial training. And it's important to realize that applied behavioral analysis is much bigger than this, but sometimes people need to learn by cutting up an activity into tiny little pieces and then teaching those little pieces. And for buttering a piece of bread, you may have to divide it into 14 parts. Maybe you can collapse some of them together. Maybe you have to end up with 30 different parts to get this taught. It depends on the needs of the child. Where to find out more about applied behavioral analysis? This is a real good website. It's also in your notes, so you don't have to scramble to write these things down. Another real gift from the applied behavioral analysis people is the idea of a functional behavioral assessment. So in other words, identifying the behaviors, selecting what interventions are appropriate, and then integrating them throughout all stages, I should say all stages of life. So far as development, continuing to developing the program of somebody with autism. And the neat thing about the functional behavioral assessment is that it can be generalized to any approach. It's not just for applied behavioral analysis. So I think that's pretty neat. When we're conducting a functional behavioral analysis, we look beyond the specific behavior and what are some of these other variables that are just causing Karen over here to flap her hands and to act pretty autistic. Is there something in the environment? Are the lights too bright? Are there fluorescent lights, for example? Is she bored with what she's doing? Or on the other hand, had she looked at this math worksheet and completed the 10 problems in her head before I've even given the instructions to the class on how to do it? So is she bored out of her mind? So these are just some things that we need to consider. We always have to ask why. And again, this can be generalized to all kinds of interventions and into biomedical and into sensory as well. There's many ways to conduct an FBA, functional behavioral assessment. I think dividing it into these 6 parts can be a helpful way to frame on how to go about doing this. There's more gory details on conducting a functional behavioral assessment in the Autism for Dummies books and many, many other sources that can help with this. The TEACH approach. TEACH approach, as I mentioned before, is really good about setting up an environment so that the child can be successful. So let us suppose we have this environment set up that involves folding up pieces of paper and stuffing them into an envelope and so on. So we have everything organized just so that it's pretty clear as to what needs to be done. We provide instruction as to, for example, where we fold the paper, and even something as simple as the silhouette as to where it's supposed to go can be of great help to someone on the autism spectrum. And we just order the tasks as we see here. Fold them up, stuff them in the envelope, stamp them, and then put them in the bin. Teach.com, that's a great place to get more information about the TEACH program. Daily life therapy, that's the one that comes from Japan. And they feel that the foundation of wellness starts with physical education, physical fitness. So children that are involved in this program, as well as the teachers, spend hours doing exercise. They'll start out by jogging around the school. They do jumping jacks. Every child that goes through the school learns how to ride a unicycle, walk on stilts, do tumbling, and various other physical feats that we generally don't think about that people with autism are able to do. Somehow they get them doing these things. Once they get the physical in order, they then move on to the intellectual, emotional regulation. And how do we get emotional regulation? By teaching success and self-help skills, also art and music. Every child that goes through that school learns how to play the recorder. Some of them join a band, and they have a jazz band that rivals any high school jazz band. It's just that all of the students in there are on the autism spectrum. That's the only difference. They also provided for me the covers for my first 2 books. I figure if I'm going to be writing about autism, then, well, the covers should be drawn by someone on the spectrum as well.